Welcome to the latest episode of Leadership and Culture in Healthcare. My name is Matthew Winn, hosting this podcast. And this week, we're on to another chief exec, but a relatively new chief exec. So welcome to Birju Bartoli. Birju, welcome to the podcast. Why don't you introduce yourself and tell the listeners where you work and what you do?
Okay, so afternoon, Matthew. I'm Birju Bartoli. As you said, they're relatively new. I'm still using that card, Chief Exec of Northumbria Healthcare Trust, which is a combined acute and community trust in the northeast of England. I am 114 days into post, and I'm still doing that reflection of, the first kind of 100 days. What have you achieved? What have you broken? What have you not broken? And probably a little bit about my background, if that's helpful, Matthew. The NHS is my second career. I'm a scientist by background. So I came, I would say, into the NHS late. But I've been at Northumbria for 21 years. So it's the only trust that I've really worked in. I started here on a 12-month fixed term contract, and 21 years later, I'm still here. So I guess anything is possible. And we might perhaps later on talk through about why I've stayed, why I've not moved. I've not done that traditional thing that you hear of people changing organisations every few years. I chose to stay here, stay in this trust and stay in the northeast. But we might want to touch on that later on.
Yeah. So scientist into Northumbria Trust. What roles have you done at the trust prior to be appointed as the current chief exec?
Yeah. So I've probably done most operational jobs in the organisation. So I've managed the full spectrum of operational services, and then I moved into more of a corporate function. So that was around planning, performance, governance as my first director post back in 2012. And I was the senior responsible officer also at that time for our new specialist emergency care hospital, which was the step change in our clinical model that we had. And then I've then slowly taken on more and more, took back on more operational areas as well as my corporate portfolio, including IT at the time, moved into a coup role and then a deputy chief exec role, and then this. That coup and deputy chief exec role was for quite a short period of time, just because our structure, we never really had it in our structure. It got put in place as a consequence of the then chief exec being involved more in some national roles, so we put in a deputy at that point. But up until that point, our structures were really quite strange, I would say, compared to other organisations. But maybe that's a bit of a theme that will come out throughout the rest of this.
I'm already here. I'm already thinking the headline for this podcast will be "What a Strange Trust," but I'm sure that's not going to be true. So,
in a positive way.
Yeah, of course. You said with the grin then, your previous chief exec, so many will know that was Jim Mackey, and you said he was working a bit nationally. So that was 2 or 3 jobs, Jim Mackey. So, and as I would say to him regularly, as I was doing 2 jobs at some point, but presumably that means you as deputy were taking quite a lot of the slack and learning the trade whilst Jim was still there, but actually had quite a lot to do on that national job running the elective world.
Yeah, and I think that for me was a really nice entry into the chief exec arena. So you could arguably say start to play in that arena, but you've still got the full support of somebody else taking the real heavy weight. You've got somebody there to check out things with, about decisions or ideas or direction of travel. You're not quite on your own. And I think that's probably one of the things you do notice stepping up into then now being in the chief exec role. It can be quite a lonely place in terms of, I'm lucky I've still got a chief exec network now that I link into, very much so. But you can see how if you don't have that network and that trusted network, it can be quite a lonely place. So it was a good stepping into role before actually applying for it.
And therefore, just kind of characterize a bit for people that don't know about Northumbria, the trust. What kind of sets it apart from others? So we don't want the glossy. We want just because actually the reason we're talking about your organization is because of its great staff survey results, which is where all these conversations with chief execs in this series for the podcast came from. And you're unusual because you've got consistent good staff survey results across all of those domains over many years.
Yeah, I have to preface everything that I say with I've only worked in this organisation, so I can say stuff, but I only know Northumbria, so I'm going to give my apologies up front about whether it's different or not, because you may have listeners that say, well, we all do that anyway, so you know you're no different to the rest of us. I think, and the beauty of Jim leaving and myself being in post, we are very different people, but we have similar values, and those values are not and don't just sit with ourselves, they sit with the senior team, they sit with the board, and they sit throughout the organisation. And very simply, it's about doing the right thing. So for me, there's always a question about what's the right thing to do here? What's the right thing to do for patients? What's the right thing to do for our staff? We have a program of real-time engagement, both with our staff and also with our patients. They tell us an awful lot. They tell us when things are going well, and they tell us when things aren't going so well. And it's upon us then to do something about that. And the staff knowing that if we say we're going to do something, we do it, because that builds trust. And then if you have trust, people will follow because you know you're trying to do the same thing, and it's a trusted relationship. And with that, there's transparency. So the trusted relationship is things we can't do certain things. We will say we can't do it, but this is why we can't do it. Don't try and hide it from staff. So you're having very, I would say, I don't want to say mature stroke grown up, because that almost sounds a bit twee, but actually that you're having very honest conversations with your staff. It's not decisions are not made in a corner in a darkened room somewhere. They're done very much with the board, but also with the rest of the organisation. And sometimes things are difficult, but actually sharing that they're difficult and saying this is hard stuff that we're trying to get through. This is what we're trying to balance. This is why we're doing it this way. I think that builds trust and confidence of not only your staff, but also your staff understanding the impact that will have on them and on patients, and what that might then mean.
And Birju, you made that sound so wonderfully simple, which in essence, of course, it is. But behind all that, there's no doubt some real kind of grind and grit to make that happen. So just unpack a few things for us then. So you talked about we listen in real time, we engage in real time with our staff and our patients, and we do something about it. Just what does that mean? How does that manifest itself? What would we see in the trust?
We have a program, but they both use a very similar mechanism of a series of questions that an independent team asks our patients. If we take the patient experience program first, and that feedback is given back to a ward or a department within 48 hours for them to then be able to act and do something on it. So it's the use of information in a way that we can either, so that when they see that information, it's either, yep, I know why that happened and this is why it happened and I can do something about it, or even that positive praise that they will get as a consequence. Similarly, we have fairly recently, back end of last year, started doing so we had that in our wards and departments for an established program for quite some time. We started doing it in ED, and one of the reasons we did it in ED was because, as there is nationally everywhere, real pressure on the emergency departments. Our staff told us that they felt really quite rubbish about the fact that they thought they were delivering really poor care as a consequence of the huge pressures. And that was actually impacting on them, how they felt about their job, how they felt about themselves. And despite us telling them, saying, look, I know it's really pressured, but we get compliments coming through all of the time saying, we know you're really busy, but your staff are wonderful. They didn't believe it. What we see now through the real-time patient experience is you will see that the patients say the waiting times are too long. Scores are really low on that. And we can see that. We can see that in our performance figures and everything else as well. But they say when we do get seen, we're treated with kindness and compassion, with dignity, everything's explained. So all the things that the staff were worried about, they can now see, actually, your patients are saying this about you. And it's not a lie, because you can see they're saying the waiting time's rubbish. But actually, what we're grateful for is that when we are seen, we appreciate how busy they are. And these are all the things we get out of it. We can use that information not only to improve staff morale, because it is pressured in the ED department, but also there's some soft intelligence from the questions that come out, which will help shape how we move our clinical model on in the future. So it's got a double whammy. That's something that we've been able to use both in terms of what our patients have told us, but I've seen a positive impact on what that means for our staff.
And so that continual feedback is really important to really frame what your staff are doing with patients all the time. What about, you talked about engaging with staff in real time, so you'll use that patient feedback. Are there other things that you're doing just to make sure that you're understanding the strains and stresses from staff as well?
Yeah, so this was particularly, so we set this off during COVID, and we could see a real link with every time there was an announcement through the national team, you could see how our staff felt about it. So either scores would plummet or they would go up, depending on what the latest news was. And I think for us during that period of time in particular, it wasn't necessarily about doing things, but about providing information and providing reassurance, because you could get a sense of the mood of the organisation. We had a part of that survey was, one of the questions is around, do you have the tools to do your job? And the scores were really quite low, or at least low for what we wanted them to be. And we instantly thought that meant, not for us to jump to conclusions, have you got enough trolleys, wheelchairs, bladder scanners, Dynamaps, all of that kind of stuff? Off we went and said, right, let's go and make sure everybody's got enough of these. Surveyed again, and the tools of the trade were still, the scores were still really low. And we're like, hold on a minute, we've done all of this stuff. Why have these not moved? And we said, well, can we just be really clear? Do we actually understand what people, when we ask the question, tools of the trade, what people actually understand by that question? And it turned out the tools of the trade was actually all about IT. It had nothing to do with Dynamaps and trolleys and wheelchairs. And a conversation came out of that about how the IT wasn't, in some parts of the organisation, not everywhere, but enough to make a difference, wasn't up to scratch. And it was things like the printer doesn't work, the iPads don't work, there's not enough PCs. So it wasn't about the technical infrastructure or anything like that. It was just the day-to-day workings. And as a consequence, we were able to fix that, where the IT team took hold of that and said, right, we will go into these areas where the scores are low and actually spend a week in there and understand what the issues are and fix them. Following survey, the results go straight back up again. I know it was your point earlier, Matthew. It's not difficult. It's just asking the questions and then doing something about it. So I think that need to, if you say you're going to do something, you must do it. And if you're not going to do it, explain why you're not going to do it. And I think that's throughout the organisation, be that something in a clinical area, something within a corporate function. Don't say you're going to do something and then don't do it, because that just leads to letdown and frustration.
And how over time have you built that leadership culture that you just described? Because that's a real it's a real tough thing to pull off, isn't it? Of leaders who are adaptable enough to lead and help people look forward, but listen and react to what's happening, and also shape the culture and the performance of what's going on in the team. That's a really tough thing to pull off. I always think, when I was taught to our leaders and our managers in our organization, those middle managers, those people at ward level are doing the toughest jobs, because they're facing into our public, our patients, and they're managing tough functions. How has the organization developed those types of leaders to do what you just described?
It's quite interesting because you automatically, and I have somebody used to say to me, Bijou, just because you think it's simple, it isn't simple. Because a lot of what I think myself and others would say, and I go back to that phrase, well, it's just about doing the right thing, isn't it? What's the right thing to do in this circumstance, whilst at the same time not losing sight of what is to come in the future? So how do you stay one step ahead of the curve in your thinking as well as dealing with today? We recruit both in terms of our managers, ward managers, our consultants. We do a values-based recruitment exercise and all of our interviews are based on a values-based interview. So that very much looks for examples of how you have actually done X or Y, not the theory behind it, but how have you, give me an example where you have. And those values are matched against our organisational values. So I think that plays a huge part, and that was a big shift we made as an organisation probably about 15 years ago, I think. So we've got a lot of people in our trust now who've gone through and have been recruited in that way. So we've probably got that critical mass now. I think as an organisation, we probably also do that balance between, and I think people need this, doing the here and now, but also saying continually, what next? What next for your service? Where next? What's coming clinically round the corner in terms of the latest new drug, the latest new technique that actually we need to start exploring now? What's happening to our population at the minute? Is there a particular, for us in particular, particularly in Northumberland, our elderly population is growing at quite a rate, and we have to how is our clinical strategy going to match that in terms of both our working out into community, but how we work with our partners. Both we have two local authorities that we work with, and how are we building those relationships to make sure we're aligned in some of our thinking about what our respective local populations will need. And I probably should say at this point, I do think, hearing from other colleagues, that I am very fortunate in terms of our work with two great councils, both Northumberland County Council and North Tyneside Council, both chief execs, fantastic colleagues to work with in terms of a direction of travel that we are all committed to. I think probably one of the other things that, and again, this might be in other areas as well, this is my local hospital. This is where I have my procedures done. I have my appointments done. This is where my family will have, my friends have. Similarly, with both local authority chief execs, this is their local hospital. And I think you can't move away from how we all have a vested interest in our local community and our local public services as a consequence of that. And I think that's actually really powerful. We have people who, in our organisation, 3 generations deep working here. We're a large employer, so you're not either, that's probably being overly simplistic, but we're a large employer here as well as the 2 councils from a public sector ethos point of view. And I think that makes a difference. People want to be proud to work where they work, because you don't know who, person in the street, person in the pub, they've all got a story to tell. And you want to be able to say, yeah, that's my place, but say that with pride.
Yeah. And I'm sure that shows through in people recommending the organisation to get care and help, isn't it? And it's that question of getting it right for our patients, getting it right for our staff is just that double-edged sword of well, actually, that's a sweet spot, isn't it? If you get the balance right between those two. you're not far off
Absolutely.
from getting it right, are you?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So that culture that you just described, you talked about your values-based recruitment and interviewing 15 years ago, and then that creates a real um, deep kind of knowledge in the organization about this is
Yeah.
what it's about. I guess the flip side of that is you have to sustain that culture, don't you?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because otherwise that culture can diminish fairly rapidly if you're not careful. And is that something that you and the team talk about in what you should be doing?
Yeah. So we also have on top of that several different levels of leadership programs. And we also have very much a close working between clinicians and managers. And that clinician manager relationship is again built on trust. It's not about getting one over on anybody. It's about working to each strengths of each other. And I think that our organization, and you'll hear others no doubt talk about this, is very much clinically led. But it has a manager, so we always work very closely to help turn things into a reality. Understanding that clinician voice mind can be very busy also doing a day job as well as that leadership element. So we not only have clinical leadership programs, but we have strategic leadership programs, which is where clinicians and managers are learning together and developing together. And that by clinician, I don't just necessarily mean medic. That can be an AHP, senior nurse, consultant with, the full array.
Yeah.
And that does need, I think that needs that continuous cycle of leading together. So on top of those our improvement programs again are done with a clinician manager partnership. It's all about that part working together. And whilst that again sounds really simplistic, I think putting people in a room together pays, and learning together pays huge dividends where one's not expected to be the expert. So you're both at it, but you'll come at it from a different angle and a different viewpoint.
Yeah.
All those programs, I should say, are well embedded in the organization. And it is just a constant renewal of, okay, what's the next program that we need, or how do we need to tweak that? Particularly because we're moving into a different era now, more so, not just now, that's been building for a while, about that wider system leadership. So actually, how do we get system partners in on those strategic leadership courses as well, so you can just see things from a slightly different angle than you might have historically been.
Yeah, it's one approach, isn't it? And then, as you say, you've got deep relationships with the councils. It's the one public sector working together.
Yeah.
So let's think about you, Birju. You've been on the board for quite some time. You said you've already done, I think it was every operational job possible. So I won't test you on some of your skills on knowledge on some of those areas because I will soon get found out. But what do you therefore, as an executive, both in your past executive roles and your current chief exec role, what's your personal impact on the organization?
You see, now you've got me.
Now, see, this is interesting, isn't it? It's the first time you've been quiet in the whole of this discussion because I've asked you to talk about you.
Personal impact.
Well, let me help you out then. So how do people say you come across? How do you operate in the organization? What would a normal day be of the Birju effect in the trust?
Yeah. So I'll go back to my comments right at the very beginning. I think because I've worked in the organization for a long time, the people that have been here probably for the same length of time I have at least, and probably some people who've been here for a lesser amount of time, would say, she always says she'll do what she says she's going to do. So my word is one that I take very strongly. I will always try and do the right thing, and by that I do, like everybody, all leaders, I guess, will make myself accessible. I love to go out and about. I love to chat to people just to understand how they are, how life is for them, be that at work, at home. I do see ourselves. My kids make fun of me because I have two phones. I have a work phone and I have a home phone. They've given up ringing on my home phone, so you never pick it up. You'll only pick up your work phone. So I'm not saying that's necessarily the way to be, but the organization is very much part of my life. And I get and the need to separate out the two, but I feel very invested in the organization. And I think that is what people would say about me, that she's like a stick of rock. You could cut her in half and it would just be Northumbria all the way through. And that is perhaps why I made a decision quite some time ago. I wasn't going to leave. This was it for me. This is where I wanted to be. I was always given all the opportunities to develop myself and my interests. I had a sphere of influence that I don't want to say do what I wanted to do. Clearly there were boundaries, but that ability to influence across the organization was always given to me. And I think that's probably what's helped me in this role and transition to this role, in that it felt quite seamless because the organisation knew who I was, they knew what I was about, they knew what to expect, because you can imagine Jim had been here for as the chief exec for 20 years or close to 20 years. That was a massive upheaval potentially for the organisation. New chief exec, oh my God, what's that going to bring? I don't think anybody really thought, what's that going to bring? It was just, oh yeah, we know her. Next, that it was a continuation of, they knew what to expect, and the style in which they thought it would come has played out.
And some really interesting nuggets in there, aren't there, about continuity?
Yeah.
People trusting you and knowing that you are dependable in that respect. You've made a choice, as you said earlier. You haven't bounded about between jobs and said, "Oh, I want to go here, I want to go here." You've been clearly steadfast and dominated by the organisation in many respects, which does beg the question. How do you sustain that? Because you've just said I answer my phone. I've invested a lot in this organization. How are you finding the balance that you can be effective as a chief exec? Because you've also said earlier it's quite lonely.
Yeah, so I'm really lucky in terms of I have a chief exec network that I can tap into. That is really helpful for me, where I can say, I think I need to do this, or I think I need to be worried about this, something that I would have not have come across in my previous role. Is that right? I'm thinking of doing this. Have I missed something that, some secret club that I should run this past that I don't know about? Or and that chief exec network, and that's a mixture of people locally but also nationally that I've known, people who've become friends through meetings in other arenas, or where I've worked with on specific pieces of work in other areas, is really helpful. I am also in the process still of building my new team. So there's a number of execs who I have to say I work with some fantastic people, really, really supportive. Couldn't do this job without them. Who I think we're now building and adding into the team to backfill my old post, but we're doing it slightly differently. So I think as that team consolidates, I think that will obviously give new space and freedom to all, because everybody's picked up something additional. So I think that'll give everybody a bit more space, and that's just a timing issue more than anything else. What I've had to learn is not to step in. So allow the team to do what they need to do. I've been used to stepping in, sorting out issues, of actually saying, you need to go to these and these people. So I've always been very accessible. I remain very accessible, and I pride myself in being accessible. However, we need to not circumvent, I'm going to say, the systems and processes that exist on how decisions are being made. And I'm very, very mindful of that. So do tend to say that's a great idea, but you need to run that through this person, this person, this person, rather than just go, yeah, that's a great idea, let's do it.
Yes, the wisdom when to step back and let others lead those things is quite hard, isn't it? It's always remarkable. I always find it remarkable how what I think is just a friendly chat over a coffee that suddenly then gets turned around 2 days later is, oh, Matthew, I've been told that you have said we've got to do this. And I was like, I never said anything of the sort. And yeah, same issue, isn't it?
Yeah. So I'm learning that, and it's hard because I would say this again, I blame my upbringing. I've got a bit of a bizarre work ethic in terms of, I recognize I'm probably on the spectrum in terms of my work ethic, but that I'd say that is my upbringing. And I've had to measure that, and I am very measured in my expectations of how others work, because I am a bit too far off the scale. My kids will say to me, Mum, if we won the lottery, you would still carry on working because you'd die if you didn't work. It's that kind of, in our household, it exists like that. But I have had to learn to moderate those expectations. And so some of my, I love what I do, not even I like what I do. I love what I do. I've always loved what I do. I genuinely like the people I work with at every level, so I'm interested. So picking up the phone or bumping into somebody and having a chat is not a problem for me. It's not, oh God, I'd rather be somewhere else. Well, no, I'm quite happy being here. And I think for me, that's a balance I'm always going to have to keep or be very mindful of, that it doesn't go too far the other way, because I actually like doing that kind of stuff.
And it's interesting when I listen to what you're saying, Birju, is there's a real wonderful public service kind of ethos flowing through what you're saying, of this is both something quite technical, but it's also a mission, and it's very satisfying, and you've managed to fuse the things together to say this is what pushes you forward.
Absolutely, yeah.
That's really underrated, isn't it? In terms of, people talk about these as being jobs. You could never listen to you and say this is just a job, could we?
No, and it's not. If it was just a job, I don't know. Again, I'm new at this, Matthew, so maybe you ask me again in a couple of years' time, I'll maybe say something different. I hope not. I don't think you could do these jobs if you didn't enjoy them, if you didn't love what you do. But then I'm very much of the views life's too short. So if you don't enjoy what you do, we spend too much time at work. If you don't enjoy it, you need to find something else. And I've always been of that mindset. I've said it to some of my clinical colleagues who, for whatever reason, may not have been happy or may not have been in a good place. And I've said, look, I'm not saying this in terms of trying to move you on or anything, but if you're really that unhappy, seriously, life is too short. Let's help you find something that will make you happier. I had a colleague, was a consultant, who decided to, I won't tell you the specialty because people will know who I'm talking about, but who decided to come out of being a jobbing consultant at the age of 50. And I sat down and I chatted to him and said, why have you made that decision? Is there something wrong with here? Can we put something right? And he was like, no, Birju. He goes, I've had enough of patients now. And I said, okay, that's really, at least you're honest. I get that. I can absolutely deal with that. It's probably a good move that you're going to move on. And he said that I've decided if I go now, I could wait another 5 years and maybe go at 55. But then realistically, I've got only 5 or 10 years to put into a second career. Whereas if I go now, I've arguably got, another 15 years to build another career, which is another second good career. And I thought that was really brave. And I thought, do you know what? Good on you. Good on you for making that decision. Good on you for saying, I'm not happy doing this anymore. I'm going to do something that I'm more fulfilled. And he's having a whale of a time now. He's still working, but doing something that he really enjoys, rather than getting frustrated on the day-to-day grind of what was his other specialty.
And using their skills as well, no doubt, to do that.
Absolutely.
So Birju, I could talk to you for ages about your approach. But as we draw this to a close, let's think about other people who might be, your younger self or in a similar position, looking for a second career, looking for a third career for that gentleman. What would you encourage people to do to get into the leadership roles that you have done, and what advice would you give as people think about their leadership journey?
I would say take every opportunity that's given to you. Try it out, because you might not know what fits you. I didn't think I could be corporate services director. I absolutely loved the sphere of influence that gave me, but never realized that that's what it would offer me. And if you're not giving, or you feel like you're not getting those offers, go and ask them, go and fight. There's always things to do. I think if you're upfront and you're curious about trying to improve things, change things for the better, nobody will stop you. And it's those changes that then start to speak for themselves in terms of results and actions, and how you make those changes that will, I think, lead you, allow you to test what you feel your leadership style might be. I think a lot of these things, if you said to me, somebody asked me not so long ago, how do you become a chief exec? And again, I was absolutely, when you have one of those questions of, I don't know how to answer that. I said, actually, I don't know. I don't know how you become one. I didn't set out to become a chief exec. I just wanted to be really good at whatever I did. And I wanted to, very cliched, make a difference. And that's led me to this point, that being curious, wanting to make a difference, wanting to change things for the better. And I think that's what I would be saying to anybody who wanted to get into that leadership. Don't think of it of, oh, I'm being a leader. You're just doing a good job, and you're doing it and looking where to go next.
Yeah, I always answer that question with a set of flukes, chances, and mistakes is how I got here, and I'm still trying to work it out myself. So and there'll be lots of truth within that. Last thing, Birju, you've been in there for whatever 100 odd days. I joked with you before we started recording that I'm sure you've been spending all that time correcting the mistakes of Mr. Mackey and putting things in order. Jim, I don't mean it. I'm sure things were great. But what's next? What are you looking forward to kind of careering into at the Trust?
I think that the next phase for us is there's a slight shift in our narrative, which is very much focusing on performance with purpose. I think as we came out of COVID, like everywhere, there was a lot of push around productivity, hitting targets, and actually focusing on just the numbers. We lose some of that, I'm going to say, organizational, clinical buy-in. So sometimes have we missed actually the real opportunities that this allows us. So for us in our organization, that performance with purpose, our purpose is very much about our people. And by that, I mean our staff and our patients. It's about safety and it's about improvement. And a big element of our improvement moving forward is the delivery for us around the next stage of our clinical strategy. So we had a 10-year program of work. Our clinical strategy seems to run in 10-year cycles. We're coming up to 10 years next year on the big shift that we had with our specialist emergency care hospital. We're now very much talking about the next 10 years for our clinical strategy. And that discussion and framing all of that under the banner of performance with purpose really helps. So if we get the purpose right, the performance will sort itself out. And we use very much about just doing the right thing and thinking about time as being precious. So it's precious for staff, it's precious for patients. Let's not waste it. So how that underpins a lot of our clinical strategy. So it's not a big whole scale change. I would clearly, I've got a very good grounding in terms of where to take the organization next, because of all the things that Jim has done with the organization. This is just the natural next step, some of which had started already, particularly around the clinical strategy while while Jim was here.
Well, Birju, it's been fascinating listening to you. Everything from the bare and the right essentials, do the right things for patient and staff, taking every opportunity, which clearly you have done, to try things out, as you were saying to others. If opportunity comes, have a go and see what it is. Listening to the culture at Northumbria Healthcare NHS Foundation Trust and how you've just been delivering and investing in your leadership, and then those aspects of that personal reflection of, this is about public service, this is about me leading the organisation forward for the next 10-year clinical strategy. I think it is safe to say the Mackie era is over and the Bartoli era has firmly started, and it's been great to talk to you about all things leadership and culture and focus on the North East and your part of the world, and thank you so much.
Thank you.